Okay, just give me 1 second. I'm getting set up here. While I'm getting set up, I just want to reiterate a point, which is that a lot of the difference between the Rails approach and the Merb approach and some of the stuff that has been talked about is just general modularity, which seems like a cool, like, oh, that's a nice idea. But it actually scales up and prevents like really scary complications from taking hold. So some of the questions about slices, the way that's going to not suck as much is that we're not going to make assumptions in the way slices work. Is this working over here? Can it work? Oh, I have to plug it in. I have to ask him. So we're not going to make assumptions, like none of the, as few of the modules as possible are going to make assumptions about how other things work. And something that Daniel didn't mention, perhaps out of modesty, is that the Merb auth, which comes with Merb more now, is actually built on top of slices as well. So the authentication system is able to provide a more robust solution than a generator or something because of that. Okay, so here we are. Okay, so I'm here to talk about testing Merb. It occurs to me I'm supposed to have a slide that says I'm from Engine Yard. So I don't, but I am from Engine Yard, and Engine Yard is awesome. Actually, a bunch of people in the audience from Engine Yard, you should probably find them and say hi to them and say that you like the work we're doing, if you do. But I work full-time on Merb now, so I think it's, and we pay for, at the moment, the salary of a person who, Fabian, who definitely we would not have been able to make it to Merb 1.0 without him. So there's definitely a lot of work that Engine Yard is doing that makes this possible. And the general notions of encouraging experimentation, which got the project off the ground in the first place. So I would definitely say hello to Engine Yard people, and I personally thank everybody who's working at Engine Yard and makes this possible. So the first question is, why do you want to test your application? And something that people talk about is, well, I want to do TDD. So TDD is the idea that you want to drive your application on the basis of tests. And this is actually a really good idea. Another thing that people talk about is they say they want to have a regression suite. And actually, I'm not talking about TDD today. And this is perhaps a heresy here. But I actually have no problem with TDD, but I just don't think that the tests that come out of TDD are very useful regression suites. And I'm going to talk about why I think that is. Again, the thing to take out of this talk is not TDD is bad. It's if you have TDD tests, make sure that they are useful as regression suites. And I'm going to talk about what criteria you might use to figure that out. So one of the things that you want when you write tests is that you want them to be resilient against refactoring. That is not so much the case for TDD tests, right? When you write a test first, you're not really thinking about what you're going to do later. And so it's perfectly fine when if you write a test TDD style, to go back when you have to refactor your code and go refactor your test. That's just sort of par for the course, right? But when you write tests that are to serve as a regression suite, that sort of defeats the purpose. That untangles the entire web that you're trying to build here, right? If you have to go back and change your test because you're about to change your code, you don't have any proof anymore that your code works, right? Because you have to go refactor your tests. And tests, of course, are code, right? And code has bugs. So every time you have to go refactor your tests that are proving that your code works, you're potentially introducing bugs into the system. So what we're trying to build here is a test suite that will get refined over time, that will be somewhat resilient against refactoring. And I'll show an example of what exactly I mean by this. So here's a really simple class here, right? We have class, awesome. And we say puts hello. And this is a common way of testing this sort of scenario. You say make a new awesome and say it should receive puts and then call it. And that would pass, right? But now let's say I go on and I change it. I'm like, actually, I don't want to do that. I want to call awesome print now instead. And print calls, awesome print calls print. So now we're not calling puts anymore, right? And so you get a fail. But actually, nothing about your code actually broke here, right? Because when you run your test, when you run your code, when you use the awesome class here, the hello still prints on the screen. Nothing changed. Actually, nothing at all changed, except for where exactly you decided to put the print statement, what underlying Ruby method you decided to use here, right? And a lot of people at this point stop and say, well, what do I do? And this should receive thing is built into RSpec, and there's mock testing suite, so it seems like an easy thing to do. How do I do the alternative? So what I do is this. The problem is this isn't built into RSpec, right? But it's just pretty easy to write this. You write, capture, call this thing, and check to see that the output matches. I realize I should probably have a slide that shows how this works, but it's like 5 lines. It redirects the standard out, and captures the output, and et cetera. Right? But now you have a test here that no matter how you change it, as long as the output still comes out somewhere in standard out and still says hello, then you still have a working test, right? And you don't have to worry about the fact that you change puts to print, and now you have to go, oh, I have to refactor my tests, and now I don't have proof that things go on the screen anymore. What if I make a mistake when I'm writing my tests, right? So here's some rules that I'm going to give, about 3 rules that you want to focus on when you're writing regression suites. Again, I'm talking about regression suites here. I'm not talking about TDD. That's a different story. I personally write my TDD suites, my regressions. I write my TDD style tests in this style, so I end up with one suite. But I understand if people would say, I want to write my TDD test with should receive. That's not really the point I'm making here at all. So here's the 3 rules. First of all, if you have a broken interface, something should fail. Okay? Rule number 2, if you have a working interface, test should pass. Right? Those are 2 really easy rules. I could really stop here. Right? If you accept those rules, and I think those are almost axiomatic in terms of the rules, at this point you should realize that having tests that say should receive in them create all sorts of scenarios where you could have passing tests with broken code and failing tests with working code, right? So pretty much at this point, axiomatically, if you want a regression suite, you can't do that. The third thing is more of a fuzzy idea, which is test what you care about, right? You don't actually care that a certain method got called, right? You don't care that puts got called. You care that text went on the screen. So you should test that. So here's what happens in a Merb app, roughly. You say, I want to go to example.com. Some filters get called. There's controllers, views. Some helpers get called, right? But what do you actually care about? You care about the fact that something went back. You don't actually care how that works. And the problem is that frequently, after doing this for a little while, you do this, right? You move some helpers into views. You add some new helpers. You add some partials, right? And if you have a bunch of tests that say, I called a specific helper, or a view got called, or I rendered, right? Then when you go and change this, you have a violation of the first 2 rules, right? You can have plenty of situations where you have a test that tested something that is no longer operative. So let's say you move a helper into directly inline in the view, because that made sense, right? You may have had a test that said a certain helper got called, but now the helper is no longer getting called, right? So now you have a failure when nothing actually broke, right? And conversely, you could have a test that said in which you mocked out something that is no longer the way things work. So you said, this helper should receive blah and return some string, right? But now you deleted the helper and didn't do anything. You didn't add it anywhere else, right? So now you have a test that incorrectly claims that something is going on the screen when nothing is, because you use mocks, right? So basically what you want to do here is you want to write your test in such a way that when you go and do the inevitable refactoring, you have proof that your app still works. Okay, so let's take a look at a really, really simple example of this. Okay? So here's iteration 1. I have a class, foo, application. I say awesome, it calls awesome string says awesome. And then I have a router which says match foo awesome to a controller foo action awesome and name it awesome, right? And this is a common way of testing this thing. You say, dispatch to foo awesome, and we provide in the dispatch to helper from back in the day when we were still testing incorrectly. We provide a way to hook directly into the controller, so you get a copy of the controller before anything got dispatched, and you say awesome string should get called, right? And that's fine, right? But now I go and I rewrite my app, right? And I actually no longer even call it foo, right? It's called bar. My action is not called awesome anymore. It's called coolness, right? And then I have my router. I haven't changed where the foo awesome goes to. I've just updated it to point to the right place. I haven't even changed the name of the URL. Same URL name, right? But it just goes to a different place now. And imagine a scenario where this thing is indexed on Google. So actually all you really care about is that some URL actually returns some value, right? So you have a Google page, or maybe this is part of a web services API, right? So all you care about at this point is that foo awesome actually returns the text awesome, right? So now go back and look at this. This is totally inoperative. This doesn't work at all anymore, right? I don't even have a foo class. It's going to fail and say undefined constant foo, right? Big fail, right? So the alternative, the new way to do testing in Merb is to do something like this. You say request foo awesome dot body should match awesome, right? And you could even do this. You could say request some URL awesome dot body should match awesome. So just to reiterate the rules in light of an actual Merb example. Broken interfaces mean failing tests. Working interfaces mean passing tests. And write tests about what you care about. So at this point, now 10 minutes into my talk, I'm usually 10 minutes into discussing this with somebody, and they say something like, it's too hard, right? There are some people who make philosophical objections, but actually the philosophical objections say, I want to have another bunch of tests that allow me to better isolate things. And I say, fine, go, do that. But those tests don't count towards coverage. They don't actually prove that your app works. They just test that like helpers got called. And if you want those tests so that you can help isolate errors later on in the process when tests fail, that's fine, right? Those tests just don't prove that given certain inputs that you care about, certain outputs that you care about actually happen. But the answer that I get, the claim that I get that is actually at this point pretty useful, pretty interesting, is it's too hard. So you had that capture thing that looked really easy, but you have to write that. And you have to write all this stuff all the time. It's irritating. And I don't even know how I do that in Rails or Merb. It just seems crazy. So the answer that I usually give at this point is, OK, it's time to write some helpers, right? Let's make it easy. Let's make the testing, doing the full stack testing, the black box testing, let's make it as easy as it is to mock. Let's make it easier, right? And so we have a method now in Merb called request. And there's 3 ways to use the request helper. But actually, there's one way. Request takes a URL, right? But here's the thing. There's actually, sometimes you care about the actual URL. Sometimes the thing is cached on Google. Sometimes you have a web service. But other times, actually, the only way that the URL could get generated is through your app. So there's like, URL something in a form, or a link that links from one place to another. And it's inside of an app. You never actually care about Google caching this page. It's not part of a web service. You just care that given URL speakers, you actually get to the thing that's routed there. So that's an objection that I heard a lot when I started thinking about this problem. And the solution is just to say, just use the same helper, right? Use URL speakers. So we've made available the URL helper and the resource helper in the spec environment. And you just use those. And then you're isolated from the actual URL. But I would say that frequently, especially if you're building a public-facing app, you actually do care about the URL, right? You actually want a test to fail if the URL changes, and now suddenly that URL returns something totally different, because now you want to be alerted to the fact that my web service doesn't work anymore, or everybody who goes to a thing on Google, like it breaks, or Google has to recache it, right? You actually care about that stuff. So you should think about whether or not you actually care or you don't care, but we have a way of testing both scenarios. And it's just one method, right? There's no 50 methods that all do various different ways of handling this problem. There's one method called request. Takes the URL. It also takes other things that a request might have. It handles certain things automatically, like every time you write a spec in Merb, if inside of a spec, sessions are sticky. So if you go to login, if you say request login, method post, you say params. And so what actually happens here is that the params get automatically converted into the query string and appended and sent through the entire rack environment. I'll show a slide on that in a minute. So you can say log in, and then the next time you say request/home should be successful because you successfully logged in, right? But what would be better is if you could say something like this. And actually, I'm missing a slide here. But we added a syntactical feature to our spec that lets you put this little thing over here, this request block inside of, you say given a user is logged in, or given successful login, and then you put in that block over there, that request/login, and then in the future you can just say describe login given successful login. And then everything in that describe block automatically gets the given applied to it. And since sessions are automatically sticky, it's not like in some kinds of tests sessions are sticky and in other kinds of tests they're not. In all cases, in all tests in Merb, sessions are sticky with the request helper. You just say log in, user's logged in, and then you could just go and write a bunch of tests. And then you could write a bunch of tests where the user is not logged in or the user put a bad login, and you can easily say, in all these cases, it should not be successful. It should redirect you to /login, right, easily. The way people normally do this, the old way to do this, is to do a mock in .session, like you say .session or blah, blah, whatever. And you make Rails or Merb know that .session is something special. But the better approach is to just do whatever the user would do, right, to make the login successful. Because what if you change the way login works, and now you're specifically mocking out session? So everything works, of course, but you actually don't prove that if the user types in a correct username and password and then goes to this URL, it actually works, which is actually what you want to prove. Right? So that's a simpler way. So what does that request return? So here's, first of all, a request in Merb. This is ultra simple version of this. What effectively happens is that there's a request. It goes through rack, and rack returns an array of 3 things: status, body, and headers. Okay? The request helper in Merb does exactly the same thing. Takes a URL and some optional options, goes through rack, and then returns back, not an array, it returns back a struct that has those same things in it. It only returns a struct because you having to remember that the body is rack bracket 1 seems silly, but otherwise it returns pretty much exactly what you get back from rack. So some things that you could potentially do with it. You could just say request foo.body should be hello. You could say have XPath. So have XPath just uses libxml, and it will quickly parse the output and just make sure that that XPath selector is actually found somewhere. 1.0 final. This is one of the only features that I think will change between 1.0 RC1 and 1.0 final. Have selector. So someone wrote a library. Aaron Patterson wrote a library called Nokogiri, which is a whole bunch of stuff with CSS. But one of the things it does is it allows you to convert CSS selectors into XPath. So the easy thing to do here is just to take your CSS selector, convert it into XPath behind the scenes, and then feed it into that have XPath selector. So easy to do with that library. So we'll just do that, and you'll be able to basically do all this stuff. And this is going to be way faster than like an hprocot helper or something like this, because XPath, libxml is just really fast. We also have some extra helpers like should be client error, which just means it's a 400 error of some kind, or should have content type. I sort of threw the word out and said, I'm writing all these helpers, what do people want? And somebody said, I want to be able to check if it came back as JSON. So you just say :JSON, and that automatically uses the internal Merb MIME types to say, oh, :JSON means application JSON or text JSON or whatever, and it just checks to make sure. And that would work with all user customized MIME types as well. So thank you, and I just want to reiterate a couple of points before I take questions, which is I'm not trying to say you can't write TDD. I'm saying that if you write TDD and you use mocks, that those tests don't count for coverage. TDD also doesn't need to conflict here. I personally write all of my tests in this style, including ones I write first. Just have to get used to it. And the main point is just that if you have to refactor tests in order to refactor your code, you don't have any proof that your code works, right? If you have tests and code, and you say, oh, that's fine, I'll just go back and change my tests before I change my code. That's a TDD way. That's great, right? The problem is that you don't have any proof anymore, anywhere in the world, that what you originally expected to be true actually works. And if you say, oh, I'll write a few integration tests, that's also fine for the cases where you did the integration tests, but it doesn't actually successfully test the litany of cases that you actually want to be testing, right? So you have a few tests that tests the higher level, and then you have a million tests that don't test anything at all, right? So that's not actually very useful. So I guess I'll take questions at this point. But.
So one of the
Yes, sir.
One of the complaints about black box testing that I've certainly run into over time is that it can be very slow if you're dealing with slow components that are running under your application. I mean, the database is one thing, but if you're interacting with external APIs and that sort of thing, it can get pretty bad. I don't know if there's a good answer to this, but I think anytime we're talking about black box testing, it's something that should be addressed. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I actually left out an entire important thing that I have to say about mocking. So I don't think you should ever mock your own code. I think that's crazy. If you have your own code, you should just use it. Okay? But if you're talking to a web service or databases, I think there's a third way with databases other than what people have so far. working on it. But with external APIs, the person that makes the external API, and that might be you, should expose a mocking interface that they will deal with, right? So the problem with mocking is that you're dealing with the internal API. So if someone changes the internal API, all of a sudden all your tests break and you didn't do anything, right? It just suddenly you're like, oh, I'm assuming it uses io.pipe, and now they use something else, and bam, everything explodes. So you don't want to do that. But if the person that's maintaining the web service, so I maintain a Salesforce adapter that needs to do this, doesn't right now, I should expose a mock to you that I guarantee will keep up to date with my internals. You just use the mock. That's basically part of my public API. And what you need to do is just make sure that the things that you're mocking in some slow test somewhere actually are possible, right? A lot of people will mock things that are completely not possible. It's just like, oh, this is an easy mock. I'll say it returns hello when it returns like a string of XML. And I'll just then make assertions about the hello, right? You shouldn't do that. You should return the actual thing. The mock should return the thing that might actually happen. And then you should have a separate test that proves that it's possible for that to happen in real life. But you could run those every release instead of every time you commit code. Yes?
All right, let's see. This is Graham from Manchester asks, can you apply multiple given clauses to a describe context block?
Not right now, but yes, that is a desired feature. I think probably separated by commas or something. Somebody, yeah, you could nest them.
I was just gonna. That's so funny. That was my question because that would be really, really cool. I'm using that stuff now. It's great. Thanks. But you get into nesting, that's kind of deep if you're doing like the equivalent of an integration test, let's say for checkout at an e-commerce system or something. It would be really neat to be able to chain like givens and just have it more horizontal that way. It'd be cool.
Yeah. So you could already have a describe block that has another given and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's basically just sugar for it should behave like. It's just that everybody every time people talk about it should behave like, everyone's like, I don't really, that's really irritating. So this is just a better way of doing something similar to that, which automatically handles the fact that you want it before each and stuff like that. So it's just sugar. It's cool. Other questions? Cool.